Good morning and welcome to the European School of Economics. Welcome everyone here on CamUp.com, and we say a very warm welcome to the ICE team and Sir Ranulph Fiennes as they've just returned from the Coldest Journey expedition. Sir Ranulph, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you very much for coming and for your interest. The guys, the ICE team of the expedition, which has just spent 9 months basically in the darkness, temperatures outside going down to well below minus 60 centigrade, average winds of 30 knots, and they were living together in a small steel container, like a ship's container, and if they didn't like each other, they could go outside, but they would soon be back inside. And they have survived remarkably well. They've done a huge amount of scientific work, but they'll talk more about that. They have survived, I haven't, but they have without frostbite. The equipment was brilliant. Machinery in this country doesn't like minus 10 centigrade, and yet they kept their machinery going at those extreme low temperatures. Educationally, we have done an enormous amount for state schools, hundreds of state schools. Scientifically, charity-wise, we have raised at the moment $2 million for Seeing is Believing, which is for prevention of avoidable blindness in Bangladesh and many other countries. And any questions that you would like to ask the team. Now, the team consists of the team leader, which is Brian Newham here. And over on the right, you've got from Alberta in Canada, a wonderful chief mechanic, Spencer Smurl. On my right, we've got Dr. Rob Lambert. Anything goes wrong with you at minus 70, he will put you right. And over here from Ireland, we've got Richmond Dykes, and that is our team.
And Ian did arrive safely. He's not.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, Ian is not here. He is with a very beautiful girl, and is still in South Africa.
Having a wonderful time.
And in the UK, we have a wonderful team of people. Nobody works for us gets paid. I pay nobody anything. That is the firm rule. And Tris Kay here has volunteered for the last year and a bit to work for the expedition as the nerve center. He's sitting in the front here, and he's got a wonderful team as well who can't be here today. So that's pretty much everybody.
Thank
I think.
you, Ranulph. Yeah. Thank you. So as you know, so you're here today. We're linked up to CamUp.com, and shall we start while we're waiting to link up? Or Elio, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd like to say something
Yes.
about I was asking myself, what is the reason, the very reason to face such dangers and risks? And I have the answer, because I am a very risky man. I like the danger. And I was in my life, facing many fights and wars.
Taking risks.
And I am the founder and president of this school, the European School of Economics. And I believe that our students can climb mountains and cross oceans in the business. And they have to face what you have done in your life, something that is life, and they have to see many times death in their career, in their lives. Now, I wanted just to read you something that coming from my book that can, why am I here? And among people that really faced something incredible. And I believe that what I did in my life is very much like what you did. And I understood that the external reality is none other than the manifestation of an inner vision. And we can face whatever happens in life just turning towards ourselves. And this is something that I believe that was your experience. You find yourself alone, in solitude, in stillness, and secretly and silently you see that victory and success comes from within and not from without. You have to face, you have to face the outer reality with an inner preparation. You have to be ready within yourself, otherwise you can never make it.
Well, actually on that, so question for Brian, so tell us a bit of how, because I know you've done a lot of sort of Antarctic expeditions and traversing across polar regions. How do you mentally prepare for something like that? Some of us couldn't even begin to imagine.
I think, I mean, what we've just attempted to do, as Rand said, it had never been attempted before. So it was about sort of pushing that boundary. It was about self-belief that we had the skill, we had the knowledge, we had the equipment to do that. And it's a confidence thing. And you know, as you say, I've done a lot over the last 30 years, but what we were trying to do was a completely new thing. It was pushing that boundary. So to do that, you do have to have a lot of confidence in yourself and the rest of the team. And that was, for me, that was key to what we were trying to do. If you went there with any doubt within yourself or about your team, then you were doomed from the start.
Yes.
So that's key for me.
But would you say, obviously, when you faced challenges of all these crevasses, how did you deal with that challenge? You know, so you're saying the confidence, but then obviously when you're faced with challenges that you perhaps didn't expect, how did you deal with that mentally in particular? Richmond?
Well, whenever you come up against crevasses and stuff like that, obviously people have a different fear level. I would have quite a high tolerance to fear. You learn to cope with it, but you get to a certain point where the crevasses get so big and so wide that it becomes impractical to pass them or dangerous. And at that stage, you've got a safety aspect to yourself and to your team and to the environment around you as well. So at that point, we decided to pull back onto safer ground and establish a winter camp where we could carry on with our science and medical experiments in a safe environment.
And so you speak of relying, you know, as a team and your equipment. You know, we think of this country, we never get to less than -10, and we don't cope, and our windscreens might crack. What kind of equipment is needed to deal with up to -80 conditions? Spencer?
The Caterpillar D6Ns that we took down to Antarctica with us, it's basically a construction version D6N. Pretty standard for -40 conditions. You're pretty safe down to that with almost fully steel construction. Finning, the Caterpillar dealership that rigged these out for the cold, there was several modifications we did to them to help out down there, but a lot of it was for traction, you know, and service protection for me in Richmond while we were working on them. But we did run them down as cold as, I think -52 was the coldest when we were still traversing with the equipment. And startup in those temperatures is very slow, obviously several hours, because we were shutting down at night to conserve fuel. Richmond and I took a lot of effort to get them going in the morning, but once they're up and ready, they ran a full shift, and we never had any problems with them. Very reliable down there, and I was very impressed with them.
Where are they now?
They're still on the ice at the minute,
right.
Awaiting transport back home. And there'll be a ship coming in sort of early to mid-January, and should be back in the UK come March time next year.
So it's quite an undertaking to
get
everything. Because you're not allowed to leave anything on Antarctica, are you?
Yes, everything that we took down with us has to come back out again. and that includes right down to your rubbish and human waste. You know, so
How do you manage all that?
well, the first box was a Zargi box, so it contained all the food. So that was a hard accomplishment of stuff stored till you get that first one empty. But then it's an ongoing rolling rota from there on out, and you just pack the stuff that you've used out of it, and then the used stuff into it, and everything's boxed for handy logistical purposes.
Okay, and Rob, the doctor on the expedition, tell us about your role and maybe an example of what you used for.
I guess my main role was an insurance role. You hope to never have to use a doctor. But it's fairly essential if something does happen down there that you've got someone who can potentially take care of any medical problems. And it's something that all permanent Antarctic bases down there will normally have a doctor on the staff to try and help things through the winter, because one of the problems is you can't evacuate people during the winter. And that was.
Do people realise that? So this is the thing, you're stuck there, aren't you? There's nowhere for you guys to go. I mean that's pretty intense. I can't imagine. You're in this. You're safe inside, but what happens? What happens if you want to get out? You've got to go back in again.
Yeah. Well, as I said, you can't during the winter. Evacuation is essentially impossible. So plenty of summer expeditions will go down to Antarctica and they do their thing, and they don't necessarily need a doctor, because if they need to get out, they can possibly call for a plane and get out. In the winter, it's a very different matter. So you do need to have people there who can look after themselves. And most of our team were kind of first aid trained and kind of knew how to look after themselves, which was really good as well. But yeah, it does weigh on your mind a bit that if the worst was to happen, you're going to have to deal with it. To give you an example, I suppose we were very lucky in that, I guess most people know about Rand's injury that changed the expedition such a lot, but that happened right towards the end of the summer. So we could actually fly him out, but he literally got the last plane off the continent. And after that, it wouldn't have been possible. So if that had happened a couple of months later, it would have been a very different story, perhaps.
I was very lucky having not just a doctor, but a doctor with polar training, and I was quite a long way away. The whiteout, meaning you can't see anything. Luckily, Richmond there came back, and I was able to get in his cab and start blood trying to get back into the fingers. And we got back to the vehicles, and Rob immediately did everything correctly. But I think, with no offence to British doctors that don't know about polar, they would have done the wrong things, and that would have meant a lot more of my fingers being chopped off. So having him there was absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
And Ranulph, and in relation to this not being able to evacuate, Ranulph, you could tell us more about the white noise with the US.
The White Mars project,
yes.
Probably Rob being doctor is best to say what we were doing, and really to point out the invalidity of the American experiments in that they can get out.
Yeah, White Mars was a kind of series of medical, physiological and psychological experiments put together in conjunction with many different universities and research institutes throughout the Commonwealth and also in Europe as well. And the idea is really to try and study some of the effects of prolonged isolation and confinement on humans. And the reason it's called White Mars is that it's kind of relevant to space travel, and various experiments have been done in the past to try and see how astronauts cope with these things. One of the more recent experiments was putting some potential astronauts into a shipping container in Moscow and essentially isolating them from all extraneous contact for what they thought was going to be equivalent to a space trip to Mars, so about a year and a half. And that gives some good data in terms of how people cope with confinement. But in a sense, it's also slightly artificial, because in that case that if something does go wrong, they can hammer on the door and they can get out. Our situation was different in that we could hammer on the wall all we wanted and nobody was coming to get us. But that's the same for a lot of Antarctic bases as well.
Yes.
So people who spend the winter at the South Pole or at various European stations, they also can't get out. So there are various experiments going on at those as well to try and see how people cope. And our experiments, I guess, were a continuation of that to try and add to that data. So most of the time we had something to do. throughout the long winter, we weren't just kind of sitting there doing nothing. We would spend a fair amount of our time doing various scientific research. People were keeping diaries about how they felt. We were doing various.
Yeah, I was going to ask about
tests.
diaries. Did you all keep a diary journal daily? Brian?
Yeah, I think most of us kept personal diaries. There are obviously sort of more work-related diaries as to where we were and what we were doing. But I think we all kept personal diaries, but they'll probably stay as personal diaries.
And was there a time when any one of you did get that sort of feeling where you wanted to get out, or did you feel at home immediately? I know, again, obviously working is busy, but during your downtime or at night or sleep or.
No, I think we were all prepared to be down there from the start, and we knew what we were getting into.
Yeah.
And even though we stopped the traverse, and we had to just sit there and wait out the winter, and it got very dark, very windy, very cold. We knew what we were there for, and we had lots to do, as Rob said, with medical and just getting through things every day. It went by very quickly, and of course, at moments there, you wish you were somewhere else, I guess, but it was pretty comfortable, and I'd do it again.
Great.
I have to say, when I get into bed at night, I'm lying on my back, I do like to raise my knees. Well, when I tried that, and I was only there for 1 month, when I tried that, I hit the bloke ahead, his bottom, so immediately. And if you're fat, you can't even slide in there. And if you snore, it's the conversation throughout the next day.
Who snores then?
a conspiracy of silence on that.
Everybody's not here. So.
I think we probably all snored at one point or other. I think we spread it about, I think. Yeah.
In the meantime, I'd like to say something about, suffering. It's not so bad, but I was just trying to study what makes you suffer so much, and the difference between you, remarkable man, and ordinary people that just suffer in life, let's say naturally. I think that you are facing sufferings intentionally. The intent to suffer intentionally is something that makes you remarkable. And this is what I ask to my students, to suffer intentionally. Because if you suffer intentionally, you suffer without suffering. Let's say you enjoy suffering because you contain suffering. You are not a victim of suffering. And this is very important. Now I'd like to read you something about my book. And I was facing, the duality between death and immortality. I think that you are an experiment, the first experiment to face immortality. And this is the century that will reach that goal, to be physically immortal. And when first people were dreaming about flying, it was absolutely impossible. But we are flying right now, and we will become immortal thanks to your contribute and your strength and courage. And I wanted to read you something about my book, if you don't mind. Physical death can materialize as a consequence of an infinite number of inner death. You collect traumas, negative emotions, and destructive thoughts in your body until it becomes such an unpleasant place to live that physical death appears to be the only way out. You have to practice to stop dying. You have to learn to not allow one single moment of death inside yourself. If you die less, if you are vigilant and take more care of your inner life, there won't be moments of drowsiness or lack of vitality. You are here for one reason only, to win death. You are here for one reason only, to win death. Nothing else matters. The long agony that you call reality stops existing right now, here. To win death is the only game worth playing. I look inside, I feel insecure, unsafe, sorrowful. If I am not conscious of it and do not circumscribe it, it will materialize in an unpleasant events. Career, money, success are all projected from within. How can you have a beautiful life, a winning personal adventure, if you die inside? You are here to wake up, to rise up against yourself, to start your own revolution, a silent, secret revolution to escape from a self-created prison, to come out of this stupidity of believing in the limit of all limits, the idea that death is invincible, inevitable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you'd agree that
I wanted,
the team here have been revolutionary in what they've been achieving. Oh, okay.
You are the pioneers of immortality. This is what
I
I
think-
really believe.
I think we're now linked up via CamUp.com. Yes? Hello? And
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. My name is Anna Bogomolova, and I represent a Ukrainian media holding BRG. And I'm very excited to be part of this talk and this experience with CamUp. I'm a big admirer of these great people that lead the world and inspire the world. And I have a couple of questions to the team and to Sir Ranulph. We are talking about exploration, right? And when you go to an exploration, every great exploration starts with inexploration first. And the combination of both inner and outer, quite extreme outer in your case, made you guys who you are today. So I'm wondering, what have you found in your personal inner exploration, and what we can look for in our everyday inner exploration? What can inspire us from you guys? Thank you.
I would think Brian would be the best guy to answer that one.
Brian?
I think what our journey has taught me, as I've said before, is how important that self-belief is. And if that's not to say that it doesn't take a lot of work, it doesn't take a lot of planning, you have to surround yourself with the right people, you need a lot of backup. But if you really believe in what you're doing, I think you can do great things. And I think that's a big lesson for everybody.
All right, I can go on, I guess. Well, you are all guys quite exceptional human beings, and I wonder how do you recognize those everyday life heroes? How do you encourage and support them that do nothing exceptional? They don't maybe save the world, but maybe maybe it's a single mom who raises her child, and maybe one day this child will be as exceptional as you and do something that will change the world in a great manner. So how do you recognize and how do you encourage just everyday heroes? Thank you.
How do you encourage and inspire everyday people? Well, I think you have certainly done that, like, during this expedition. Truly extraordinary. Richmond?
Me personally, as regards challenges, you don't need to do a polar challenge, but, and it mightn't be everybody's cup of tea, but if you have the option to do that, I would definitely do it again. Try and push that a little bit further. And I think if you just push yourself that little bit further every day, you become that slightly better person because you broaden your perspective and horizons. And from that, you'll develop into a better person and hopefully influence other people around you to do the same.
And obviously, it's such teamwork, and I think that's inspiring in itself, the way that you must have had to work together during that time. I think we must have belittled that, just the teamwork and the relationships you had to foster, and the patience and endurance and loyalty, generosity to each other. I mean, I don't know if you want to expand on that a bit.
I think that when we select the team for an expedition, you need good people doing the selection. For instance, overall, for mechanics, we needed 2 mechanics. We had 26 mechanics applying to work for over a year without being paid. And out of 26 people, we just chose 2. Yeah? And I give this to a guy I trust. So 3 people who are good friends, they're normally very nice people, but when they are selecting the mechanics, they become very nasty people. And we end up with the best, one from Canada, one from Ireland, but wherever. And it's not just their mechanical ability, but their characters as well.
Character. And obviously this is a character building thing, individually, but as a collective. Spencer?
Yeah, and being out on an adventure like this, very challenging, as you said. A lot of teamwork is necessary to complete the tasks you have to do out there safely. And definitely it's a good place to grow yourself. You recognize maybe negative habits in the way you've operated in the past, stuff you don't like in the way other people do stuff, and you adapt, you change yourself, and you also adapt to work better with the way other people function. And I think in a lot of ways we did very well out there for the short time we had to interact with each other during the preparation for the expedition. But really, once we got there, I think we did quite well.
How long did you have interacting for preparations?
It was quite varied. I met Ran in January of 2011 and begun the work with finning to prep the cats. I think I met Brian just a few months after, along with Ian, when they came in to start construction on the caboose. But with Richmond and Rob, they both came in quite late, with Richmond being around September. And this is just a few months before we leave in January of the following year. And Rob just met in London as our equipment was being loaded onto the ships to head south for the continent. So it was very short time together to get to know each other before we actually got stuck in the box together. But yeah, considering we did very well.
Yeah, so I think you can see how something that seems so removed from every day actually can inspire the everyday, bringing into the everyday thing, working together, having that self-belief and confidence, and small steps.
We do have a criticism that there aren't any women on the team. I spent 30 years on expeditions which were planned by my wife, and she was the radio operator and so on. We're very happy, obviously, with women on the team, but since we had no applications, that is why we don't have any.
Right.
Not a rule against women.
Okay, so any women out there wanting next time, then get the applications in. Let's see. Just while waiting, I just wondered if there's any questions from the floor, just while waiting for the gap. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes?
Can I ask a two-in-one question?
A 2 in 1, absolutely. Do you want to show you? I'll give you this in here.
You mentioned the first question is that it seems to be a strong principle not to pay people. So there seems to be a high value in character, and I just wondered that within the principle of not paying people, how you actually view that, and what's the importance in that. The second question is about technology. That as time goes on, we have more technology available to us to be able to think about exploiting very difficult conditions. And I just wondered whether or not it occurs to you to be as simple as possible with the technology, so that, if there was a time when you didn't have that technology, how far could you actually take an expedition like this?
So, 2 questions. Firstly, why do I not ever pay anybody on any expedition? Because the difficult thing before doing the expedition is to get the sponsor. And the less money I ask for, the more likely we get the sponsor. Therefore, if you don't pay anybody, you ask for a lot less. So it's just a commercial reason for not paying anybody. But there is a spin-off, which is that money is not their objective. They're really keen. The second question about technology sort of changing. In the early 70s, there were no polar satellites going round, and therefore no GPS. There were no sat phones. It would take an hour to work out at the end of the day where I was with the same theodolite or sextant as in 1900. It was only when polar satellites came that it became easier in that respect. Also, we only had high-frequency radios, not sat phones. So now, as you can see, technology doesn't always work, even whatever the room temperature is. Whereas, they were operating. I could speak easily once a week to Brian from London, whereas I was unable to speak to my wife in Cheshire because the satellite, was wrong. Everything has changed completely between the 70s and now in terms of technology. It's much, much simpler in most of the cases, but you must remember that iPhones and things which will work normally at -70, they object. Yeah. So you cannot rely on them. So it's better, as I think you said, to be simple where you can be simple. But with a D6N, you can't really be simple, presumably.
No, I think that's with part of having the sponsors involved. Everybody wants to promote the most current, the most recent product. So in a sense, you're out there, it's kind of hard. Like for Caterpillar, it would have been great for us to take something that was 30 years old, no electronics on it. You could have had a lot more faith in its reliability. But nonetheless, the machines we did have performed very well. But I think that's part of why you're forced to keep up with the current technology in a sense. And it does help you in a lot of ways, but in those cold conditions, it can hinder you as well.
Thank you. Anyone else here to Well, I have a question. I'd just like to know a sort of typical day on the ice. I mean, sort of just a rough typical day, really. I mean, because obviously it's, particularly in the plateau, how long was it? I mean, it's all dark, all the time. Tell us more.
Yes, if you had been at the South Pole, for example, when the sun goes down, it's instantly down, and it's down for 90 to 100 days, roughly speaking.
Wow, 90 to 100 days.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But where we were at, we had a gradual fading of the sun, and even after it passed the horizon, we still had an orange halo, for a few days afterwards. And Brian had worked out whenever the sun was going to rise again, for example. But we were in the middle of a bad snowstorm at that stage, and it was probably an extra 4 or 5 days past that, and we pretty much missed the rising of the sun, and it was fully above the horizon at that stage, because I think we were gaining 13 minutes a day when it does start to come back. But even when you are in the depths of pitch darkness and things like that, if you get a lull in the weather and do manage to get outside to enjoy it, you can be pleasing things like the Southern Lights, and just to be standing there to see them dancing across your head, you know, is a sight to behold.
Yeah, what was it like? I mean, you probably can't describe it into words, can you?
Probably like having, you know, two or three Christmases when we did see them, you know. If somebody happened to go out for something, you were straight back inside, whether somebody was in bed or whatever, a knock on the side of the bunk, get up, the lights are out, you know, and everybody was out with their cameras and stuff. And that was one of the uplifting moments in the middle of the darkness.
How does that, when you're sort of in darkness, I mean, does it affect your sense of time? So, you know, were you up for a long time? So again, so were your days short, and how does it affect your sleep as well?
Well, blue light is one of the things that regulates your sense of daytime, you know. And when we were in total darkness, we noticed a gradual shift where you lost the sense of getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning. We may not have been getting up till 10 or 11, but because you didn't have the blue light regulating your body clock, that was when you get up. But as soon as the sun came back, you started to notice that you were getting up earlier and earlier and earlier till we clawed it back to maybe 7 o'clock in the morning. And it's a very important fact of daylight.
Yeah, wow, interesting. And so, and Spencer, yeah, so can you just a rough outline of your typical day? Because obviously you're working very hard. And
yeah, there was quite a difference between when we were still traversing south versus our stay at winter camp. Obviously, when we were still fighting south, racing against the clock, Richmond and mine, our day could start as early as 3 in the morning, starting the preheater systems on the cats, getting that going, and that obviously starts warming you. When we were down in -50, you can't just go out and turn the key on the machine. So for a couple hours that needs to run, warm up the various systems. Then Rich would obviously get a chance to come back to bed. I would then get up, come out, and at the worst it would take about an hour of cranking on to get enough momentum into the systems to get it to fire up. And you could actually leave it to come back inside. Sometimes I'd be out an hour to 2 hours. Obviously the generator for the caboose needs to come online so we can have power for breakfast. Everybody gets their morning tea, gets ready to go. And then give it about an hour, caboose generator power would need to be shut down. All the cats get outside, bump everything free of the ice, and then we would be in tow or, you know, bridging crevasses depending on what our travel duties were for the day. Out there till about 9 o'clock, you know, a refuel on the cat at midday and just push on, and then obviously a shutdown of the machines, prep them for any possible storms that could come at night, you know, try and keep everything as ready for the next morning to save you that time. When we did stop and made our winter camp, as Richmond mentioned, our wake time shrunk quite a bit. So your morning, instead of starting at 3, you know, you get to sleep all the way till 11. That was fantastic. But as it got colder, you know, the wind never stopped. We seen wind approach, you know, 70 miles an hour, and on an average, it was 35 to 40. So our systems, your intake and your exhaust for all your furnaces, the generators, that stuff tends to plug up with a lot of snow and ice. Anywhere there's water, obviously we had some plumbing that drained out our gray water, and that stuff, you know, it could have a clean path of about 12 centimeters. In 12 hours, that's closed right up with ice. So you had a daily regimen of chores. So you'd get up at 11, same thing, fire up the generator. The generator would run all day when we were stopped just to keep that heat in there and keep us comfortable. And a team of several guys would go out, you know, just for safety. You don't want to be outside by yourself in those conditions. And, you know, just get those chores done and keep everything running just so you don't back up on yourself and make problems for yourselves. But the cabooses, like the equipment, were also very reliable. We had one water pump just have a small failure in it, but it was still functioning. And other than that, everything worked, no problems, and we got out safely.
That's amazing. You said about your morning tea. So tell, what do you eat when you? What did you eat?
An Englishman always needs his tea.
It's true, absolutely.
So that was high on the priority list.
Of course.
But just to go back what Spencer and Richmond were saying, you know, it's well known in polar winter that people's natural daily rhythms change. So we try to get some routines going, and that helps to regiment what you're doing.
Yes.
So we do certain things at certain times of day, certain things at certain days of the week, and that helps you keep everything on track. And then as the sun comes back and you start to get your natural rhythm back, then you can sort of ease off a bit on those routines. So, you know, the tea was a sort of part of that,
course.
because you can't do anything until you've had tea in the morning. So that was all
English
part of
breakfast,
that.
or what kind of tea?
Well, yeah, the food was all pre-planned. So on each day we knew exactly what we had to eat, and it would all be in a bag. So
Because you're having to consume obviously a certain amount of calories, are you, to maintain?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the food planning was done, you know, a long time before we set off.
Yes.
And Brian and his partner Joe actually put a lot of that food together in conjunction with our major food sponsor, and talking to various kind of nutrition experts about how many calories we'd need. At the time the expedition was planned, obviously, the initial plan was for Ran plus one other person to be out skiing every day, and so, given that they would be doing that, we planned on lots of calories. I think about 5,000 calories a day to get through to sustain those people. In the event that didn't really happen, and I think we all found our appetites dipped a little bit during the winter actually.
Right.
So we ended up with a lot of food left over, which has been donated to the Princess Elizabeth Beta when we left. But yeah, so we budgeted on 5,000 calories per skier per day. Probably ended up eating a lot less than that. We've all lost a bit of weight actually.
Yeah, I can see from your photo.
Yeah, it's just one of those things.
Some more than others.
Yeah, exactly. But the food on the whole was, I thought, amazing. It was one of the triumphs of the expedition, the way it was planned, the way it was all put together, and it's the kind of thing that could get really quite dull. Potentially,
Yes.
food could get quite dull in 6 months. The food we had was amazing. We all found I really look forward to a lot of meals. And as Brian said, it was a really important part of the routine. You knew you were going to have lunch at a certain time and dinner at a certain time, and people took their turns in cooking. Again, some cooks will get them.
So say, who's the best cook then?
Unanimously, Richmond is the man. He would rustle up some excellent steaks every week, and omelettes, and he even made ice cream. That you wouldn't have thought making ice cream is difficult. Richmond managed to create ice cream out of custard powder, which I thought was brilliant.
Amazing. Launch a new flavour, custard.
Custard flavour, yeah. I'd like to say a big thank you to Jo for that, because she asked me, later on what it was like as a cook, and I said, well, I can hold my own. So she actually went out and brought in extra ingredients and stuff that allowed you to experiment, So it was nice to deviate slightly from the set menus just to break things up for the guys, because I think we had 14 menus to choose from that came round. So it's nice when you can deviate slightly after you've been there 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, I'm sure.
When you're faced with, obviously you start with no money, and you know that you're going to have food for a huge number of people for a year. So I have to go to somebody, which is not the BBC, so I'm allowed to say what I want. So I went to Waitrose and needed enough stuff. So we went very carefully, and Joe decided, what we should best be eating. So half of the stuff, no, not half of the stuff, 3/4 of the stuff was from Waitrose, basically.
Right.
And the cook did what he wanted with that, including custard into ice cream, and the rest of the stuff, in case there was a big fire or something like that, had to be what we call sledging rations, which we haul, and therefore we want maximum calories for minimum weight, and they're stuffed with fat as a result of that. Maybe we did one expedition for 4 months, eating 68% fat every day, at the end of which I had a massive heart attack and blamed the bloke who did the nutrition. There's 2 different types of food.
But you can just see, meal times are an important part of my life anyway, and that sort of ritual almost, and you can see on an expedition like that how essential, and a good time for team bonding and sharing that. And so also, so you're talking about the caboose and sleep, keeping warm. That's sort of, were you warm in your caboose, and was it comfortable? And what kind of equipment, sleeping bags, things like that? Surely you had particular. Were they made for this expedition, or?
Well, the cabooses themselves, which were, as Rand said earlier, they were basically converted steel shipping containers, but they had a few windows in them. They were very well insulated, and they also had it's like a tea cozy on the outside. So they're actually very comfortable. They're very well fitted out inside, you know, and they were made to our design. So it's a very comfortable. It was very short on space. I think the five of us, our living space was about 7 meters by 5 meters, which is quite a long time for 9 months we were living in there. So there wasn't much personal space, but in terms of comfort, they were excellent. We were always warm. You know, we had running water. We had a shower which we'd use sort of once a week. So it was, you know, it worked extremely well.
You only allowed to use it once a week because of.
Well, one of the big problems in the polar regions is always water. You know, there is no water, so the only water that you can get, you have to melt snow, and that takes energy, and that takes fuel, and it takes, you know, quite a bit of effort to go out there when it's minus 50 and 30 mile an hour wind to dig the snow up and to put it into the tank to melt it. So it's sort of self-limiting. You know, you want to shower, but you don't really want to have to go outside to dig up lots of snow. So you sort of balance the two. But I must say that it worked extremely well, and we were very comfortable. Yeah.
But there was a problem because they were breathing. If they hadn't been breathing, it would have been okay, basically.
Well, I'm pleased they were still breathing, actually.
Yeah, I think what Rand's saying is, we did have issues with condensation, because obviously you can't open the window to ventilate the place. So we did have quite a bit of ice building up on the inside of the cabooses. So that was one of the jobs that we had to do to manage that. Yeah.
And your personal equipment, sort of, are you wearing, you know, particular jackets? And again, so I mean, Ranulph, you obviously had skis. Do you all have skis, or was it?
Yes, there were all skis there if it did come to an extreme emergency of some type. But considering nothing went into a crevasse, you would have sat where you were at tight, you know. But if you had to go somewhere, yes, there were skis for everybody, cold winter clothing for everybody, and everybody has an individual makeup and can deal with cold in a different way. So it was down to personal admin, how little or how much clothes you wore, and how you dressed your hands and face and stuff like that. Because the last thing you want to do in a polar region is start sweating. Because if you start sweating and then you get cold, you'll start to get the ingress of cold back into your body yourself, and that's the last thing you want to do. So it's a very important aspect of it.
And also they very often they had to go out with radar out ahead, with the clothes on of a particular type, sometimes masks, and hopefully the radar would detect the huge hole before they drove in. But it was obviously particularly frightening for the drivers, and the feeling of the lurch as you start forward down, knowing they're 200 feet, you know, 25-ton vehicle towing, well, maybe 100 tons of fuel. Very frightening. And so the radar was important, but it wasn't terribly clear, was it?
Normally with the radar, Brian would be actually interpreting signals. I'd be kind of towing the radar out in front, and Brian would be looking at the screen. And I mean, Brian, maybe you can talk more about that, about how easy it was to interpret. But yeah.
Yeah, the radar that we're talking about, it's what they call a ground penetrating radar. So whereas a ship uses a radar to look for other ships in bad visibility, we were using the radar to actually look vertically down in the snow, and that then helps you look for crevassing. Crevassing was a big issue for us, and it was one of the main reasons that we didn't get across the continent. So the radar is a tool that we were using to try and work out where the crevassing was, whether we could go over it, whether we had to go around it. An extremely useful tool. It does take a bit of interpretation, and you have to use it alongside the visual signs that you get. And someone who's experienced in that sort of terrain, you can sort of predict where the crevassing is likely to be, which way it's likely to be running. So if you use the radar alongside that, it's just another tool that you can use. What made it more difficult for us was that once we were in the dark period, you lost a lot of the other visual signs that you would put alongside the radar data. So it was almost like you were running with a blindfold on. All you had in a lot of instances was the radar data, and you couldn't take all this other information in. And operating the radar in the really dark, windy conditions again was very difficult. It had never been used in that way before, and it was probably one of quite a few lessons that we learned, was that next time we'd probably set it up differently. We'd use it in a different way, but extremely useful nonetheless.
You paved the way for
Being with you,
expeditions.
I feel a part of your team.
Next time.
Next time,
Okay.
yeah. Next time.
You can see that you don't need the physique du role. I mean, I can see that all of you are not giants.
Well, they were when they started.
I can be part of it.
Yeah,
You don't need so
one problem is
muscles.
spectacles.
Yeah,
I had a rule for 30 years: we would not take people with spectacles because they messed up. But then about 15 years ago, I started to have spectacles, so I dropped that rule.
Good. I'm doing exercises with my eyes and avoid glasses.
Very good.
And I am sure that in a few months I will recuperate my sight.
Good luck.
I think we're linked. Yeah. Uh-huh. Hello.
Hello everyone. Hello. Hello from the European School of Economics in Rome. I would like to address 2 questions to Mr. Fiennes.
Women are better
I would like to know what actually is your dream, and also I have another question: what actually pushed you to do this journey?
Well, obviously we all have different motives. All the team have different motives. I have for 25 years worked with a doctor who specializes in nutrition, and 5 or 6 years ago, Mike Stroud was his name, he rang me up and he said that our rivals, the Norwegians, were going to plan to do the last big polar expedition in Antarctica for humans, because in the past we've broken most of the existing world records over 40 years, but this one we thought was impossible. But if the Norwegians were trying to do it, obviously, as Mike said, we would have to start trying ourselves. So we started planning it, and we realized the best way would be for 2 people on skis, but instead of using the rule which we've always had, not to have hand warmers or any artificial heat, we would break that rule and we would start using every known device to heat bodies known to mankind. And also we would use an aircraft during the summer to pre-drop dumps, so that we didn't have to carry 500 pounds like in the past. We had much lighter loads to cope with the dark and the winter. So I went to the Foreign Office Polar Desk near here and said this was our plan, and they laughed and they said, well, you will not get a permit to go down there in winter, not just because you're British, but any person in the world will not get a permit from their government during the winter unless you do the correct things. So instead of 2 people with skis, we started getting the best vehicles in the world. It took us 2 years to work out which was the best vehicle in the world, a thing called the D6N. And then we would need the best mechanics in the world, the best doctor in the world, and most of all, the best team leader. And Brian Newham, we're very lucky to get, because he, for how many years have you been in Antarctica?
Well, too many, Ran.
So we started putting the team together, and when we were ready to do the trials, we wanted somewhere at -70, but the best we could do was North Sweden, which only produced about, what was the temperature?
I think -38 was the coldest we hit.
Yeah, so it wasn't very good, but it was better than nothing, and that's where we did our first trials about 2 years ago, I think. So that's how it came together, and the whole thing was the fault of Dr. Strug. Yeah.
And your dreams, or was this is one of your dreams?
We collectively do have a polar dream, but we're not talking about it because the Norwegians might hear about it.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have it? Oh.
Work in the build-up to this project, and then in January of this year, you were left in Antarctica alone, and I wanted just to ask, how did you find that contrast? Was it psychologically difficult to find yourselves alone in Antarctica? And what were the mechanisms you used to kind of deal with that over the past, essentially the past year?
I think that's if you asked each of us individually, you would probably get a different answer. For me, it was that moment when we were left was the moment of commitment. Despite all the planning that had gone before, all the thought that had gone into what we needed and making sure that we had the best, getting it all down there, which was a huge task. But the moment that we were left on the ice, for me, that was the real start of the journey, and everything else that led up to that just I wouldn't say it disappeared, but it shrunk into insignificance. And suddenly we were faced with this huge challenge, and it was the moment where there was nowhere else to go. This was it. And it was quite an emotional moment as the ship sailed away, to think that now it's up to us, and it's up to that self-belief. It's up to us to improvise when things go wrong. And it's a big moment. For the other guys, maybe they had other feelings, but that was the big moment for me, really.
Open it up.
Well, for me personally, as like Brian said, it was the start of the expedition. Probably hadn't fully sunk in, and was probably more sad to say goodbye to friends that he'd spent the last 2 or 3 weeks with in Cape Town, doing the final preparations and unloading when we got to Antarctica. But the thing that I was looking forward to and drove me on was sort of threefold: the science side of the expedition and the medical, and getting to the South Pole and McMurdo. And I think when we reached that point of no return, where we had to stop, you had a big mental adjustment to have within yourself, to realise that you weren't going to go any further, see the South Pole or McMurdo, and you had to readjust your mental thinking to prepare to sit there for so long and content yourself, basically. So
yeah, it's a big adjustment.
It is.
Did you talk about it? I'm a woman, so we talk about things, but I don't know. Nick, did you all just deal with it on your own individually?
Pretty much on our own.
Yeah.
We never sat down and had a group discussion as such how everybody was dealing with it, but you may have been off in 2s or 3s or whatever and just had a chat between each other, you know, everything okay, you know, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But everything cope with it remarkably well, and as I say, it's just a mental step in progression, you know, but you have certain things to look forward to, the sun coming back and the aurora and stuff like that, and it's days like that that carry you through it progressionally.
There must have been a slight bit of relief after all the crevasses. Was there a sense of relief to stop, Spencer?
I think, yeah, in a sense, definitely there was. You know, there was a lot of heartbreak in that, knowing that's it. You know, we're not going to get to go any farther. We're not going to see those things like the South Pole, like McMurdo Station that Richard mentioned. But after pushing so hard, you know, the tension's growing with the relationships between us. The temperature's dropping. The sun's been gone now for about 2 weeks, right at the last point there. And these crevasses went from about, 2 meters wide, where you just kind of dip into them, to, growing past the limits of the machine. To a point where if you did break through, you'd fall through without touching the sides. There's no chance of recovery. It's going to be a permanent stuck there. So when we stopped, I think we were approaching 50 days of, 18 hours a day labor and work going. And, everybody's starting to get cranky and, you're pushing on, everybody's stressed. So yeah, when we made that decision, as I said, the disappointment and the heartbreak of knowing you're not going any further, there was a sense of relief, we could relax, we get a bit of a break. We did still have to come back north about 5 kilometers to get out of the current crevasse field that we'd gotten ourselves into, and was the worst of them at the time. But yeah, once we stopped, I think a couple of us slept for maybe 3 days straight, didn't even open the curtain, just catching up on it, and it was a nice break.
But I think when you say the word adjustment, it's just that actually the expedition changed shape, isn't it? You still achieved everything you did, and you could continue your scientific research where you were. It would be good to talk about that. I'm just going to check this new one. But again, so we could focus on the science side of things and the research that you were then able to do because you stayed put on the plateau. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, we planned. I mean, this big kind of program of scientific research had been planned in the lead up to the expedition, and obviously it had assumed that we'd be continuing with the crossing. And also there'd be a significant amount of skiing as well. Ran and one would be skiing. So that was what led to some of the scientific research. And one of the aims was to contrast how, for example, 2 people skiing would cope with the crossing versus 2 people driving vehicles versus 2 people doing other stuff. So obviously when the skiing stopped, some of that went out of the window. And when we stopped later on, some of it did as well. It did give us more time to do the science once we stopped, but the validity of the science and what we actually get out of it probably will not be quite as valuable as it would have been if we continued, but that's just the way things are. But stopping, what it did allow us to do was to actually expand some of the science program as well. So although I was taking the lead on the medical stuff, we also had quite a lot of science that was physical sciences, so looking at snow and things like that, and Brian was leading that. And at the moment we decided to stop, it was decided to try and expand that program if we were going to be stationary and we could do more science than we would have been able to do otherwise. But Brian's probably the guy to talk to about that because he led it all.
Yeah, well, on the physical sciences side, yeah, we were doing everything from weather observations. We were doing snow sampling for various institutes, looking at sort of bacteria within the snow and water isotopes. And transportation, and once we became static, that sort of developed, and we had more time. The fact that we weren't moving meant that we could get a longer term data set in one location. So that sort of once we'd stopped, that sort of ramped up a bit, and we kept that going until we came off, literally 2 days before we came off the ice. So I'm not a scientist, but once the samples get back, they'll go to all the institutes, and we'll have to see what they find. But that was in a way that was part of the decision when we had to call a halt. It was quite clear that we couldn't push on to cross the continent. The risks had become unacceptable, conditions were deteriorating, but also running parallel to that was the fact that we'd been travelling so slowly because of the difficulty of the terrain that we're actually burning more than twice the fuel that we'd allowed for. So there was a big practical element to it as well. So continuing on just became an impossibility, really. We perhaps could have pushed on a little bit further, but we knew at some point we were going to have to come back because we didn't have the fuel to cross the continent. So that suddenly presented us with this opportunity that by making that call, we could actually develop the science side of the trip a bit more. So that was one of the winners, really.
And as Brian says, that all these scientific samples, 9 months of work, are packed away and labelled for the people who will actually use them and analyse them. And a ship can't get in there. The team is now out, but the equipment is still to come out. And over the next 2 months, I will be getting sponsors, whether it's DHL or whoever it is, to every single thing. The human waste of everybody for 5 months has got to be removed from Antarctica to be burned somewhere. And all this sort of stuff has got to take place. The guy who's been working for 5 years, who's not here, Anton Bowring, has put this together. Again, huge amount of work. The South African government and their ship helped us hugely to get in there. And as for the International Polar Foundation, the Belgian base, famous explorer Alain Hubert and his wife Gigi have been hugely helpful and are right now making it possible to get everything out. And hopefully those samples will be in London for collection by the end users by next February.
And I just want to quickly touch on the charity element. We're looking to, because I know you've had some medical testing when you returned, and obviously before and during, but also just bringing also in the charity, the Seeing is Believing, and just the phenomenal amount you've raised for that. But so linking in the science and the charity, tell us about the physical testing you've had, because I know that you were monitored. It's a question for you, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean the charity aspect was, I think a really, really important part of this expedition, and I think most of us felt that as well. That it was particularly when we found out that we couldn't continue the crossing. We wanted to maximise what we could do to raise money for the charity. And Seeing is Believing, for anyone who doesn't know what Seeing is Believing is, they're just a fantastic organisation that aim to treat avoidable blindness all around the planet, and it is a big issue, and it's something that's actually quite easy and quite cheap to do, is to deal with these things, to treat children and to treat adults with cataracts, and you can really transform someone's life. So in terms of the work they're doing, it's just a fantastic charity. I urge anyone here who can to please try and get behind them. In terms of the link with our science, one of the scientific studies we were doing was to see how our eyesight was affected by being in Antarctica. And there were various theories that one, the altitude we were at might affect our vision, but also the lack of contrast, because you spend so much of your time looking just at kind of white and not really having anything to focus on, that could affect your eyesight. So we had a raft of tests here at the Moorfields Eye Hospital here in London before we left. We repeated those tests yesterday when we landed. And during the expedition we also did tests every month on people's eyesight. And the equipment we were using for that was exactly the same kit as the Seeing is Believing people use when they go to villages in Bangladesh or various places in Africa. They need to have small portable equipment they can use to look at people's eyesight in very remote places, and we were using exactly the same thing. And we were hoping, as well as getting the scientific results, we were hoping to kind of prove how well that equipment worked in these kind of environments. And so hopefully that will lead on to better kit for Seeing is Believing. Hopefully also more money for Seeing is Believing. And if at the end of all of this, if what we've helped to do is to save some sight, then I think that's a brilliant achievement.
So you might win these spectacles, is that right? As your expedition? Or Ranulph, you won't let them, will you?
Well, what Rob is saying, we went out with the actress who's our trustee, Joanna Lumley, who Bangladesh is, where she's been before, and we went out there, and one of the things we did in the hospital was lots of mothers are sitting with their little baby of 3 years old, They're not allowed to remove the baby's cataracts until they're 3 years old. And we were in there 3 days after the operation, and they start with the bad eye and then go to the good eye. And I was very honoured to remove the bandage, and the child is sitting with the mother, and they remove the bandage, and for the first time in 3 years, the mother is seeing into the sort of eyes of the baby, and vice versa. And that's only £20 out of our $2 million. So, and the spectacles that they get are only £9. And with those spectacles, that child can go to school, and that can affect their family life later, in fact, their whole life. And so it's the first time I've seen the actual end users of the charities we've raised. And altogether, our expeditions have raised £18 million. But this time we hope to, or 2 million, we hope will get better over the next year.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I think we'll agree. I mean, you realise this expedition is, when we start talking about it, how vast it is, not just the physical journey and the undertaking and the years of preparation and planning, and obviously why you were there, but the wider expanse and the inspiration. And I know that you've been inspiring schools through the education programs as well, and then the charity and science element. So we're also really excited to continue finding out more about what this isn't the end yet, is it? And paving the way for future polar expeditions. So thank you so much for sharing all your stories. Really, really wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I hope that you can come again and be lecturer for our students. That they need people like you that can really know how to face difficulties and problems in life. You are the best teachers for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.